Hi, let's get into it. Our asynchronous work isn't going to take us very long today, but it's very important that you understand what it is we're going to be focusing on. Our learning target is to analyze conflict as a tool for characterization. So as you start to develop your characters and your creative story more, I want you to introduce conflict. This is going to go hand in hand with your vocab work around the different elements of plot, because you need conflict in a story in order to create that rising action and to create that climax. So in order to do this, can you find your digital notebook, scroll to the notes section. You're going to title these notes conflict. And then can you follow along with me here as we insert a table? And I want you to go 3 over and 5 down. So it'll say 3 by 5. Let's get organized here, and then we'll go back to the actual content of our notes. The organization will give you some clues, though. So you're going to title this first one internal or external. This is going to be a categorization tool that we'll use in order to classify whether a conflict is internal or external. Then in the middle, you're going to say person versus. Now, this is the terminology that we're going to use to classify different types of conflict within the umbrella of internal or external. Obviously, every story isn't just based around people, right? Finding Nemo was an example used in the vocab, and that doesn't really revolve around people very much, but we're going to use that word person to refer to character or main character. And then lastly, I want you to write example. Now, the examples, this work here in this column, that's what you're going to need to have done in order to participate in synchronous class on Tuesday. So make sure you have all of your examples generated by the time we start class. All right, what is Ms. K talking about? Let's get started. So every story needs to have a conflict, right? That's what drives a plot of a story. And we're going to classify these as internal and external. So our first notes we're going to take is an internal type of conflict, and this is a person versus self, right? Internal means inside. That means the conflict is inside the character's head or situation. So when we're talking about person versus self, a good keyword is decision. Can you go to your notes now and write internal and then person versus self? And I also want you to write that keyword of decision. To be or not to be is a person versus self conflict. Batman has a ton of person versus self conflicts because he's kind of angsty. You also know from probably maybe just even looking at a few of these examples that most stories include more than one conflict. We're going to talk more about that in a little bit. So internal, person versus self. Take a moment now and come up with an example, maybe from a TV show or a movie or a novel that you've read, of a person versus self conflict. All right, now let's look at some external conflicts. We've got 3 different types of external conflicts that we're going to work with today. So perhaps the most simple one to understand is a person versus person conflict, right? Harry Potter versus Voldemort conflict. Person versus person, a good keyword for that is fight. Good guy, bad guy, mean girl situation. These are all good examples of person versus person. So let's take that note too. Person versus person is going to be external, which might help to explain or clarify any differences in internal. Internal, it's in your own head. External, it is not. Person versus person. And then we're going to write that keyword fight. Now, can you come up with an example on your own of a person versus person conflict? All right, let's take this one now. Person versus society. So person versus society differs from a person versus person type of conflict because it is not just one person or maybe a couple of people that are bullying or fighting with someone else. It is when somebody is facing maybe an ism, right? Ableism, racism, sexism, ageism, It could also be, we see person versus society happen a lot in dystopia literature and dystopia films, and sometimes in horror films, like when the main character is the only one being like, there's something wrong here. Person versus society. Hunger Games is a good example of person versus society. We have Katniss kind of fighting for her own survival in some person versus person conflicts, and maybe with some guilt, a little bit of person versus self in there. But her main struggle is with the entire system, the world that she's put into, right, and going to the capital. So let's go ahead and write person versus society. And then our keyword here is resistance. You might be able to come up with a different keyword, that's fine. This is, of course, an external conflict. And I want you to come up with your own example of a person versus society conflict now. All right, that leaves us with just one more, and this is person versus nature. So we've got dear old Jaws up here. Our keyword for that is survival. Sometimes it's things like Bear Grylls or whatever. Often it could also be something like a health struggle, right? If you have a character that is struggling to beat leukemia, right? That would be a person versus nature conflict. So let's go ahead in our guided notes here. This is again external, and it is person versus nature. Please come up with your own example here. This is your work to share out with the class when we come together on Tuesday. Make sure that you have an example for each type of conflict and you're ready to share. All right, thanks so much. Bye.